Thank you very much, Gazel, and good afternoon to everyone joining us from wherever you are in the country. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me in sharing my research. I really enjoyed doing it. It was something completely different to anything I had done before. So as Gazel said, I have just completed my MA with iCeGS at the University of Derby, and my research across the whole of my master's was broadly focused on post-18 decision-making and higher education guidance. That's because my background is that I'm a 20-year teacher. I teach politics for a living. I have been involved in guidance for post-18 students for about 10 years now. I'm currently the director of Future Pathways, and that means I look at all of the things our students do after they're 18. As a student myself from a working class background, first in family, only in family, I found the widening participation in HE guidance to be something that really interested me. And therefore, looking at how students make these decisions was something I thought was really fascinating. So with that in mind, the problem that I found when I was looking around what I wanted to do my thesis on was the decision making that students made routinely threw up that they were not always making the best decisions. So the Student Academic Experience Survey from 2025 said that 44% of students would have made a different decision in HE having completed their degree. That might have been a different course, different university, both. So all of those statistics together, and that's really problematic if half of our young people are saying that the decision they've made wasn't perhaps the one they anticipated it being. And as I started to look into this, I was really, really struck by this quote from Ball about choice and decision making. And I think so often in HE, it's framed as choice. Do students choose to go to university? Do they choose a particular course? And actually, it's much more about decision making, because choice suggests an openness, whereas decision making is about power and constraint. And understanding what constrains students when they're making these decisions about higher education is crucial to helping us give them the right information. So to that end, I started by looking at the theoretical frameworks that already existed, with a view to finding any gaps in the literature that existed for this and working out where my research might fit, and making sure it wasn't replicating something that was already done. Although there are a range of interacting models that look at the different factors that students use when choosing higher education, the one that most interested me was Perna's model. It looks at the 4 interacting layers that students have pressing on them when they are trying to make these really big decisions, probably the first ones in their life over which they have real agency. So at the very outside, Perna talks about the social, economic and policy context. So government policies around widening participation, around fees, around student finance and the debate there that is raging at the moment. Also around the economics, things like pushing STEM over HASS subjects and so on. The third layer, one in from that, is all the information that higher education institutions give out to students. As someone who works really closely with young people, this is a layer I feel really strongly about. HEI information is problematic. Irving, from my research, was talking about this information not being neutral. Obviously, higher education institutions choose what to put out. Similarly, Bradley found that huge amounts of students don't trust information from higher education institutions because it's deemed to be biased. They are trying to sell their product. So this sits in kind of comparison to league tables, where so many students do want to look at the league tables and try to use that to make a rational choice. The second layer, coming closer to the students, is the school and community context. So their social capital, their peer group, all of the kind of influences in their life around them, what their school encourages them to do. And then lastly, their habitus layer of their demographics, their cultural capital, their socioeconomic status and their parental education background. And all of these interacting models, including Perna's, all look at HE decision making as if it's a zero-sum game. So students are going to either use these layers and they're going to apply, or they're going to use these layers and they're not going to apply. And what I was really interested in was the micro values within the habitus layer. Not so much are you going to apply or not, but actually do the specific values about university choice and course choice that parents hold transmit to their children. So do they all share the same view on education, on location, on reputation, on course modules, rather than just go or not go? What is the sub-values within those decisions that are influenced by habitus? That led me to the rationale for the study. There's already a ton of research on demographics, on parental influence, and the interacting models that say yes, go, or not go. But there is far less research on, within that decision to go, what is valued? What of the possible choices a student can make are the things that they prioritise, and are they the same thing that their parents prioritise? Do we see alignment between parents and children? Or is the habitus actually something that doesn't seem to have the same level of impact as perhaps someone like Bourdieu would have suggested? So my study aimed to look at their influence on those individual values through the lens of Bourdieu, assessing whether parents were really the source of the strings of the moves that their children make, and whether the values that their parents hold are transmitted to their children when they are making those HE decisions. But this was where it got a bit interesting. I love everything about HE anyway, but this was where perhaps I caused iCeGS a bit of a headache, because I desperately wanted to do this quantitatively. My background is social sciences, so I sit in a hinterland between qualitative and quantitative anyway. But all of the research that I read in journals, a lot of it was done on qualitative studies, working class families having interviews and being expressing their values over what they felt was important. And as useful as qualitative information was, there just seemed to be a dearth of quantitative information. And as someone who works in social sciences, I wanted something that was far bigger, that could have a bigger impact and bore out more than 6 people being interviewed. That isn't to say that isn't useful. It was just something that I felt was missing in that literature gap. It was also a personal challenge. I honestly haven't done maths since I did my GCSE when I was in year 11. So this was something that I wanted to revisit and have a look at. The key reasons I found that this would be valuable was the idea of finding those patterns across the demographics, so testing the hypothesis about transition within subgroups. That if it worked, it could be scalable up. I focused very regionally with my research, but if the research bore out, it was something that could be replicated with relative simplicity. But also within my quantitative analysis, I wanted to be able to pair parents and students from the same household to be able to also lend a kind of qualitative aspect to it. So although I'm looking at it through a quantitative lens, it was still giving me specific data on parental pairs with their children. To do this, I used Microsoft Online Forms and I collected pretty standard demographic data. I sampled schools in the East Midlands, so 3 schools, a boys' school, a girls' school, and a large state school college, FE college, to try and get some variation. I asked year 12 parents and year 13 parents and students, resulting in just over 150 responses, of which 13 also were specific parent-child pairs that allowed for that comparison. Very early on, I knew that I wanted to use a Diamond 9 model. And this was something that was a bit unusual, and I think is born out of being a teacher. So having been trained both as a history and politics teacher, a Diamond 9 tool was something that we were really well used to using because it allowed students to prioritise their values in university course and choice, but without forcing false comparisons. And when I started to look into this, it was evident that this was not necessarily a research method that had been commonly used before. So I did have to do quite a lot of work on how this would work on Microsoft Forms. And if you are interested in the Diamond 9 model, I am talking about it at the NICEC National Research Conference as well. This model broadly and very quickly forces students and parents to take 9 different values and place them in a diamond where 1 is the highest priority, 1 is the lowest priority, and the others are arranged in bands around the centre. What I was seeking to avoid was untruthful rankings, where things that students and parents really didn't mind where they ranked could be put on the same level. I have subsequently done some further work on this, and I think if this was expanded, it's not dissimilar to Q methodology, perhaps on a smaller scale, but it really was interesting to see how this worked in reality. To analyse this, I absolutely went to town on SPSS. It was really exciting to learn how that system worked, and I know it sounds super geeky, but it really was. I was able to use cross-tabulation to compare things like the parental education backgrounds of students, their tundra quintiles, gender, ethnicity, and household, and how each one of those individually affected the sub-values. I also used Kendall's tau, exact agreement counts, and mean absolute difference mathematically to compare parent and child correlation, as well as producing overall Diamond 9 models. All of that is very nuanced. I'd rather talk about the findings because they were really interesting. So for anyone involved in guidance of these kind of students or in HE and widening participation, what was fascinating was the differences that came out in the different kinds of parents. Just looking at student course choice overall, without breaking it down into demographic groups, the Diamond 9 model showed that the things that students prioritised was the subjects they enjoy, the grade requirements of those courses, and the university reputation. I never asked them to define what reputation was because I didn't want to get into, at this level, the nuances of is that socioeconomic reputation, is that league table reputation, is that employer reputation. I left that for the students to develop themselves and for the parents to develop themselves. So students had a kind of mix of hot and cold information as an overall cohort. Parents were much, much more interested in cold information. Will this get you a job? Is the university a good university? And then will you enjoy it? And will you enjoy it was far less important to parents than the outcome that a student would have as a result of this. So those sub decisions, when they are making their choice on how do I pick a subject, for parents and students was really different, suggesting that actually perhaps the habitus that they share, they might be encouraged by parents to go, or they might be encouraged by parents not to go. But within that decision making, there is actually perhaps more disparity than there is similarity, because there is such a difference in prioritization. Now, I've only included one picture of what my research looked like, but this was littered throughout my thesis. So if we compare the findings on university choice rather than course choice, we found there was much, much higher agreement. So parents and students were really, really aligned and did seem to have a transmissive value within course choice. So 8 of the 9 values that I gave to parents and students to choose between and rank into the Diamond 9, they placed in exactly the same layer when it came to picking a university, with university reputation at the top, location, opportunities, and friends and family experience right at the bottom. However, because I was able to extract the data from this, rather than just having a Diamond 9, I was able to have all of the percentage data. What was really interesting is although students had a high priority on reputation, around in fact 56% of students placed this as a very high priority, parents placed a much greater value on university reputation, with 86% of responding parents saying that reputation was at the top. So the Diamond 9 gave us a really nice way to compare parental values to the student values, but also it can hide some of the level of agreement of those two values underneath it as well. The key findings in terms of demographics then. This was the crux of the argument. In order to get to habitus, the habitus of each student is defined by a range of social and economic factors, their kind of horizon for action almost, as it were. And I break it down into 5 key areas. It's absolutely possible that it could have been more. The reason that it wasn't is simply the scope of master's level research. The 5 areas, I started by looking at parental experience. Did parents have a background in higher education or not? For families that had parents that had been to university, one or more parent, there was a general agreement that hot values and hot information was more important than cold information for both parents and students. Both parents and students of HE experienced families really highly rated university reputation, and they really highly rated subject enjoyment. In fact, the agreement between HE experienced parents and their students was incredibly high. The top 3 values was 100% agreement. And this is broadly because those families and those students didn't see going to HE as a decision. So where so much of the research is based on, given your background, are you likely to go or not go? For these families, that wasn't a decision. The student was going. And therefore, the values they seemed to share, admittedly from qualitative data, was more aligned because that was the decision that was being made. The decision wasn't, shall I go? The decision was, where shall I go and what shall I study? This was starkly contrasted with non-HE experienced families. So students whose parents had not been to university, far greater prioritization of cold values. They were much more swayed by grade requirements on course pages. They were much more swayed by career necessity. So the overlap between HE and non-HE experienced families was very small. But more than that, the overlap between non-HE experienced parents and their children was also really small. In the top 3 of the Diamond 9, they actually only agreed on one thing as a high or very high priority. Parents were far more interested in cold information, students still interested in cold information, but often linked to things like their enjoyment as well. And therefore, for them to be relying on grade requirements and career necessity, this means they're relying far more on HEI data, which, given the problems that Bradley had identified with this in student mistrust of it, and that education has become a marketplace, so HEIs are effectively selling their services for really quite high fees, this is really important because these students are relying on a very different information bank than their HE experienced colleagues. And that will be reflected, I think, in the takeaways for advisors of how we could kind of bridge this gap, and particularly this knowledge and information gap. The second demographic breakdown was the tundra quintiles. So tundra quintiles, if you're unaware, are postcode-based indices of deprivation. It looks at progression to university, but it also looks at a range of other economic factors to rate areas from 1 to 5. Quintiles 4 to 5 are the areas of highest progression, and quintiles 1 to 2 are the areas of lowest progression. For students who came from postcodes that fell within the highest progression areas, they had a very similar prioritization to families that had HE experience. So they prioritized subject enjoyment, they prioritized university reputation, both parents and students alike. There was a high amount of value transmission within that decision-making process. By comparison, the lowest progression, they had the least amount of overlap, and they also prioritised far more of the cold data. Now, tundra quintiles are really important because if a student lives in a low progression area and they go to a school within a catchment area of a low progression area, that means that their exposure to HE is also limited. So a little bit like the non-HE experienced families, this means that their reliance becomes far more on cold and provided data because they're not surrounded by an environment in which they can see the experiences of higher education or get advice from people who have been. The third demographic pattern that I looked at was household income. I broke it down just into two to make comparisons possible. So those who earned over £50,000 as a household, or those who earned under £25,000. For those who came from households that had over £50,000, there was a high correlation of parental and student value, with subject enjoyment, university campus, and reputation all being seen as the key things that students and parents alike both valued within the choice. However, for those with a lower household income, it was all to do with cold data, but there was also a far greater disparity between students and parents. And I really liked this idea that this could be born out of HE being a guaranteed cost. A lot of the research around low-income families is that higher education for those families is an absolute cost. They know what it's going to cost them. There will be debt, and it's a lot of money. But there isn't a guaranteed benefit from it, because there isn't a guaranteed job at the end. There isn't a guaranteed particular salary at the end. And if you look at the news raging at the moment about student finance, you see why that lack of a guaranteed benefit might be really impactful for households with lower incomes. All of these were analysed separately. There is likely intersectionality between HE experienced families, high tundra quintiles and household income, as there is likely intersectionality between non-HE families, lower tundra quintiles and household income. However, within the space I had and within the scope of my research, I didn't have an ability to do the cross tabulation and intersectionality of those groups. I think that would have been really interesting. And it would have been useful to see how beyond the boundaries of these columns, that intersectionality came into play. The other two patterns that I looked at were gender and ethnicity, to see if parents of boys and parents of girls shared values, and the same with ethnic minority groups and white students. For gender, what was fascinating was it was the highest alignment between parental micro-values and student micro-values. Either 8 out of 9 values or 9 out of 9 values were shared between parent and student within a gender category. However, parents of girls and girls themselves, and parents of boys and boys themselves valued different things. Female students and their parents both ranked subject enjoyment as the top thing that a student should go to university for, whereas parents of boys and boys themselves all ranked career necessity as the reason to go to university. The second factor that they shared in common for female students and their parents was to go and gain knowledge and expand your knowledge bank, whereas for male students, it was to get a good job. So it was fascinating that the transmission based on gender seems to be incredibly high, but yet parents and students themselves had totally different outlooks on what their micro values for HE choice were based on their gender. And that was the highest agreement rate I found in my whole study. Ethnicity was a bit more tricky. My sample size was quite small for ethnicity, and therefore I had to group in just two groups, so white students and minority ethnic students. Given that in the East Midlands we are very diverse, I had hoped I would be able to break those down a little bit more, but I simply didn't have the respondents. What was interesting, though, was when broken into these two groups, there was still very different outcomes between them, but they had a similar pattern of replication between parents and students that the gender did. So white students and their parents rated subject enjoyment and campus experience very, very highly. And there was a huge transmission overlap between what the parents believed and what the students believed. For minority ethnic students, the agreement rate was just as high, but the micro values were totally different. Minority ethnic parents and students valued grades, the necessity for a career, and the reputation of the university as their top three. So students having totally different transmission of values based on their cultural and ethnic background. This does kind of support some IFS findings that subject choice sometimes by students, and particularly of students of minority ethnic groups, is determined by the lucrativeness of that subject afterwards. But the sample size was quite small, so I'm a bit reticent to draw huge conclusions when I know that there's more data that I could look at on that. In addition, I took the 13 pairs of parents and children that lived in the same household who also answered the survey. So for all of the demographic breakdown groups, I just took the overall demographics and sorted my 150 responses. But there were parents and children within the same household that had answered the survey. And from that, I was able to apply mathematical formula and bivariate correlation to work out whether the demographic overview was borne out within the household. This was much more mixed, and this suggested something slightly different to the demographic overview. So when comparing a parent and child in the same household, there was a stronger correlation with university choice than there was with their course choice. So 4 out of 10 pairs showed statistically significant correlation. Course choice, it was lower. There was 3 out of 10 with strong correlation, but it was none of them reached the marker for statistical significance. So within the household, even though the households will have the same demographic markers, what we saw as an overview for a demographic breakdown was not borne out. However, what was the Diamond 9 in terms of agreement with the top 3 and the bottom 3. So in 6 of the 10 pairs, when it came to course choice, and 9 out of 10 pairs when it came to university choice, they had a 67% agreement on the top 3 things in the Diamond 9. And that's where my title came from, the idea of it being messy. It was born out of a quote from Diane Ray and some work she had done on this. And certainly the macro demographic trends when doing the parental and child analysis suggest that value transmission is not absolute, and it's perhaps messier than the overall demographic data suggests. I think that's really important. I do an awful lot of work on widening participation, and so much of that work is based on the demographic trends, because that makes an awful lot of sense. But if that's not being borne out necessarily within households, then we also need to consider that habitus is there, but it's not always as deterministic as perhaps the overall demographic data suggests. And that might affect how universities decide they need to approach their widening participation agendas. I think my research also shows generally that choice for a lot of students isn't choice, it is decision making. This kind of ties in with careers theories, Sheen's anchors. An anchor would hold a student back from having open choice, or Hodgkinson's A Horizon for Action, where actually what they can see is really the only choice they have. But I really did find that Ball's definition of the difference between choice and decision making is so evident in what these young people are having to face when they make these higher education decisions. The last one of the value transmission was the hot and cold information patterns. Certainly, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds with less experience of HE had a far greater tendency to rely on cold HEI data. That's so important. In a job where I see the reality of this every day, I have students who will apply to university, they will miss their first choice offer by 5 grades and still be accepted. But if a student is in an environment where they're not getting that information, that hot information, where what they're reading on a website is you need 3 Bs to come here, and they don't have that, they become a victim of their own kind of data. They have no one to interpret it for them. And it's really important that as careers advisors, as HE advisors, we understand that information that we have is neither neutral and it's not neutrally received either. So many universities put on teachers and advisors days. They will give us information, they will be helpful. And I really do think that is from a good place. But that information is not neutral. And so much of the guidance that we might get our information from is these providers who are not providing us with neutral information. So how on earth are these students supposed to interpret it if we struggle? In terms of implication for policy, information provision is not enough. So really, when the Robbins report came out in 1963, it made a big deal about informed choices, students making informed choices for university. But this really assumes that all students are rational with the same capacity to interpret the information with which they are provided. And it also, to some extent, assumes they all have access to the same volume and detail of information, which simply isn't true. And where those students are having less access to hot information, their decision-making becomes far more difficult. The second one is that habitus does shape perceived options. So widening participation students, those who meet the contextual offers or the flags for indices of multiple deprivation, this requires addressing not just because of the access that it gives, but because the values they have for students is how they view themselves within that world. And this is really challenging for universities. I'm working with a university at the moment on their action and participation plan. And one of the questions we have about habitus is if we encourage students to attend this university, because even if you didn't think it was for people like you, it is, will they get there and fit in? Or will they get there and be one amongst a sea of people that are not like them and just feel out of place? But comparatively, if we don't encourage those students to break down barriers, to understand that specific universities might be for people like them, how will that barrier ever be broken down? And there's a real ethical dilemma in that impact of habitus on perceived options. The last implication for policy is that gender difference is so important, that it seems that male and female students hold systematically different values. And this is a reproduction of gendered economic and social structures. We see so much that it's boys that are driven towards STEM and girls that are not. Girls are driven more towards HAS subjects. And this has a similar problem to the habitus problem. If we encourage girls to do STEM, that's great. But if they're the only ones then that do it, will they feel that they are in a place that is inclusive? Will they feel they're in a place where they can thrive? Or will they just feel like they are there and they have no support network around them? But if we don't try to change the gender differences, how do we break down those barriers and achieve social justice? So there's quite a lot of policy that needs unpicking around how we make university accessible for all, but without making people feel like they're a statistic, like they've been gifted something simply because of a demographic characteristic, or simply because they're filling a quota. There are also implications for careers practice. For CEIAG practitioners and when conducting interviews, it's really helpful for us to know students' habitus. If we are lucky enough to work in a school where that information might be readily available, then we can access that quite simply. If, however, you are working between schools, conducting, for example, Gatsby interviews with Year 11, sometimes schools are more reticent to give out that sensitive information. But by not allowing us to know what a student's background is, where they come from, actually, it's really difficult to understand the values and barriers that they come to the meeting with. And although our job is to unpick that, it can stand us in a better stead to do it if we understand the impact that habitus has on their values, and more importantly, on their parents' values, because we might be able to tailor advice to them, but they have to then go home and sell it to their parents, who might not have the same opinion as they do. And ultimately, in a world where student finance, for example, up to the age of 25 is determined by parental income, parents do have an awful lot of leverage on student choice. So understanding the holistic nature of both the student's habitus and what their parents' values might be can really help us to give far more tailored advice. For students, one of the things we can do is teach them critical evaluation of HEI data. I have a fantastic lesson I love doing on how league tables are constructed, all the different metrics that are used, and effectively being able to show students how this system can be gamed. Not to totally debunk league tables, but to allow them to use it in a much more meaningful and purposeful way. Similarly, what do the employability stats really mean? What does the 15-month marker out mean? How much of that is employment? How much of that is further study? And what's the difference? We live in an AI age. There was a terrifying statistic out of the US last year that something like 1 in 5 students took all of their information about college choice from AI, from no other source other than AI. If students aren't able to interrogate the information from HEIs, then we are just setting them up to replicate that information. For parents, as careers practitioners, we can target them by values. So parents do transmit values to their students, whether they're accurate or not, and whether students are willing to challenge them, that's another matter again. So as well as training our students to do critical evaluation, it's trying to train our parents as well. That can be through webinars, through work with them, through bringing them into environments, any method of communication that works on debunking values that parents might hold that aren't necessarily reflective of the current HE landscape. And I would particularly say that's both sets of parents, whether they're non-HE because they just don't understand the landscape, or HE parents who believe that they do and actually don't understand what has happened in the last 20 years and therefore are not informed on current decision making. For HEIs, it's about looking at their widening participation messaging. Where we have students from different backgrounds, they prioritise different things. So prioritising the student life of a university is not necessarily going to cut through a student from a lower socioeconomic background. Universities need to try to address the values of the individual group rather than just focusing on their institutional prestige and assuming that students will understand what that means. For me, the key takeaways were then that values are transmitted between parents and children, particularly evident in demographic patterns, but that transmission is messy. Individual pairings shows far more variation. And I think that would be something to explore further if I had the opportunity. Social, cultural and economic capital is fundamental to shaping students' horizons for action. And careers professionals, we must understand that students are coming with us with their own habitus and with their parents' habitus as well. Their choice is rarely a choice. It is much more of a decision. Just to flag up, in the spirit of honesty, there were some limitations. There was a relatively small sample size in some demographics, particularly in ethnic minority groups and in the lower tundra quintiles. I did focus on the East Midlands. That was a deliberate choice in terms of managing master's level research, but it is scalable and replicable around the country. Once my data was all correlated, it did only have 13 pairs of parent and students. So that would be something that could be further explored. And as much as I loved working with the Diamond 9 tool, it clearly was something quite different and innovative. And that's not something necessary then that you would see in every study. However, the maths that sat behind it is very widely understood. I would also have loved to do that demographic cross-tabulation, looking at the intersectionality, for example, between ethnicity and income, or tundra quintiles and parental background, but that would have made the study huge, and I definitely didn't have the word count. So there is further research that can be done in all of those areas, and definitely included in that is looking at the impact of AI on that HEI information as well. And with that, I will first of all say a huge thank you for sitting and listening for 45 minutes. And I will say to Gazel that I stuck to the 45-minute brief. I would also particularly like to pay thanks to the iCeGS staff and to Gazel, who had the unfortunate pleasure of being my supervisor throughout this and putting up with many, many questions about maths, which she answered with great grace. So thank you very much. And I'd like to end with that quote from Diane Ray, which is that the messy reality is that habitus is constantly subject to experiences and therefore constantly being transformed by them. We are always going to struggle to understand the interacting layers of students' decision-making, even when we try to unpick it. But I'm pleased that I was able to look at the micro values, which I don't think had been explored widely before. And if you do have questions, I will do my level best to try to answer them.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm sure, as everyone else, we're all very, we have so many questions related to your research, because there were so many interesting findings. And just to start with, for me, the most interesting part is the fact that the choice, which is in marketized higher education system being represented as a freedom, is now showing in your data that is more operating like a risk management. So there are a certain group of students that they think that they will be punished if they make the wrong decision, and how you can basically, as a practitioner, try to approach that in a way that can benefit this whole discourse of widening participation. I'm going to give opportunity to all the participants to ask questions, and if you want to turn on your cameras or get involved in conversations, please feel free to. Okay, starting with Mark. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Hi there. Thanks very much for that. That was great. I just had a question about the comment you made about some students will receive information directly from a university and won't really necessarily know nuances behind it. So we know that for some universities, if a student doesn't make the grade on results day, they may well still be accepted. How can we work to help students, bearing that in mind, when students sort of still do need those predicted grades in order to be considered in the first place? I mean, I think I read somewhere that private schools are much more likely to give students higher predictions, and those students may never have been on track for getting those grades, but they'll get an offer and then we'll get into a university having had those higher predictions. And students in other schools will not get those predictions in the first place, and so don't have that opportunity to. Yeah, it was just a question about what could practically be done within those kind of predicted grade restraints.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like that. And it is so messy. It continues the messy theme. I think there's a number of different things that I have found that have been useful and interesting, but to some extent it depends on the placement of the careers advisor and their ability to influence. There is a distinction between private schools and state schools in terms of predicted grades, but do you know what? Take that away. 13% of students nationally go to private schools for sixth form. You hear the 7% stat, but at sixth form it's 13%. So that means that 87% go to state schools, the vast majority. And predicted grades are 33% accurate nationally. So that's not just private schools being inaccurate, they're all inaccurate. And one of the things that I think plays into this is, first of all, schools need to understand that predicted grades is not a metric that it's worth holding their departments to. So a lot of the work I have done, both as a governor and as director of Future Pathways, is to speak to the academic staff of the hierarchy of the school, to speak to governors and say, you know, whatever metrics you want to judge your departments on, it shouldn't be predicted grades, because they are inaccurate. And by hanging people's hats on that, you force them to be more realistic. Whereas actually, to be honest, the truth is they should try and be aspirational, because this is a marketplace. You tie in with that research from someone like Vicky Bolivar at Durham, who points out that entrance grades are really nothing more than a marketing tool. So universities put them in place simply to allow them to market how good they are because their grades are so high, whilst allowing students in with grades that are lower than that. And then I would couple that, I promised the last one, but 3 interlinks with, if you look at the information from contextual offer students, so widening participation students, they are often admitted with lower grades, and yet nationally they outperform students that got in with higher grades. So getting in with lower grades doesn't necessarily mean you're not academically equipped for the course. And if you take those 3 things together and can use it to allow schools to give students, you know, aspirational predicted grades, not ridiculous, because we don't want to set them up to fail, but a sort of good day, fair wind. If we can ensure that students understand risk management. So I do lots of presentations and workshops with students on them being comfortable with their level of risk. If you are uncomfortable with it, then go for a good insurance choice. If you're comfortable with it, then push the bounds and see what happens. There is always clearing. If they understand the holistic nature of that process, I think they're far better placed to beat the odds of their habitus. But if what we have is schools that are wedded to data and that won't budge, then to some extent the schools are being responsible for holding those students back from a possibility that they could have. That's a much bigger fight on a national front, but I certainly don't think that's anything that's coming from Ofsted. That is far more something that is coming from us and from HEIs setting entrance grades that are just unrealistic. The good news is that the higher education sector is currently challenging. The finances are challenging, which means that for our students, it's a buyer's market. And the more we can encourage them to embrace that buyer's market and embrace their risk, I think the more we can break that cycle. That was a really good question. I hope I answered it. And if I didn't, please come back to me.
I just wondered if there's a risk then, if a school consistently over predicts that those grades could be seen as untrustworthy, or do universities not go into that level of granular detail?
So they don't at the moment.
Assessing an application.
Yeah, they don't at the moment broadly. Some of the very, very competitive and very, very competitive courses may. America does. So for American applications, there is a real understanding that you have to be accurate and honest. And if you are consistently inaccurate, then your grades will not be taken seriously. I think the nature of UCAS in the UK means that just hasn't happened. You know, I get offers back in 4 hours. I don't think those applications have been read with any level of detail, let alone granular detail. I think it's come across someone's desk and they've hit the yes button. I think the greater risk is that we encourage students to be aspirational, and then they end up in a university that is so far out of their habitus that they end up uncomfortable. They don't thrive because they're not happy. I've been doing some work with Durham University on this with their Asian heritage students, because, you know, Durham is a university in the northeast that's very, very white. And it's, well, even if we get them there, how do we ensure they feel like they're part of our university? And I think that is a much bigger issue than pushing those grades. And I will really clarify that I'm not advocating giving a 3D student 3 A's. What we're saying is if they have some evidence, then be positive for them and see what they can do with it.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Any other questions? I think I have one. I was wondering whether in your practice you've ever encountered any examples that this politics of deservedness rather than preference is being practiced by the practitioners. Like, do you think in careers education there are obviously some rational decisions that are being made by practitioners, and where do you see the ethics of it?
Yeah, I think the ethics of it for me is really important. I'm not going to say I've got a specific example that I have seen in that, but actually one of the pieces I wrote was about, if you have a student in front of you that is really bright, predicted 3 A stars, and says they want to go to Oxbridge or UCL or Imperial or a brand named university, as it were, great. But when you have the 3 A star student that says they don't, where does our responsibility lie? Should we push them? And is it our responsibility to try to break the inequity of social justice to get them to some of these more competitive universities? Or does that challenge our responsibility to be neutral and unbiased and meet them where they are? And that tension, that ethical tension, I think is really, really challenging. I would feel deeply uncomfortable advocating that a student went somewhere that required high grades that I thought they wouldn't be happy at. And yet I think that schools often drive that we want students to go to those sort of places because it's great for stats and it's great for marketing, and you can put all those things on your website and it's really helpful for whatever Ofsted or the ISI are looking for. The reality of that is, I think that things like the CDI's code of ethics becomes less helpful because it's really codified and entrenched and unchanging. And the reality is we probably need to practice more practical ethics, which is when there's a child in front of us, what are they going to thrive at doing? And if we think that a child needs a bit of a push, then being prepared to do it. And if we think that a child doesn't, then meeting them where they are, rather than just presenting them with information that says, hey, you could get into this university because you've got these grades. That's too binary. That's taking neutrality and removing the humanity from it. And I don't think that's part of the job of a careers advisor. We should be there to guide rather than just to provide.
That sounds very interesting. And at the same time, the point that you mentioned about trying to predict whether they'll be happy or not in this university they go to is also then the question of how would you know? It's like, it's just, as you said, so messy and so multifaceted that it's sometimes impossible to try to navigate a situation without having some sort of personal input or ethical values or positions in the situation.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And it's particularly challenging in a political environment where more careers advisors have been promised to schools. But yes, let's see if that plays out. But also, those careers advisors need to be given the time and the training. One of the most valuable things that I get to do every year is go to a university and get a sense of the city, the campus, the people, and how I am treated. And then when a student comes to me and says, oh, I want to go here, I can be like, oh, okay, so have you thought about this? Have you thought about where that hall is located? Have you thought about the distance from home? Because I've driven it and it's quite far. And it gives me a much more real grounding to be able to start to advise. It's tricky because it's always your own interpretation of that university. But for students, particularly from widening participation backgrounds who don't necessarily have the financial resources to go and visit universities, having somebody who has been there and can say, have you considered, is really helpful. But I don't necessarily think schools and school leaders understand the value of allowing their careers leads to go to be at a university and get an understanding for it as a vehicle by which better advice can be offered.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Just because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to just say thank you again for joining us. It was a really thoughtful and practice-relevant session, Sarra. If you know anyone who wanted to join us, but they didn't have the availability, the recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel very soon, so please share it with your colleagues. And if you're interested in presenting your session as part of iCeGS seminars, please get in touch, email us, and we'll follow up with you. I hope you have a nice rest of afternoon, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, Sarra.
Thank you so much, everyone.